When dealing with your spouse's feelings, it's important to understand that an emotion shared should elicit an emotional response. So in other words, if your spouse comes to you and says something, and there is any emotion behind it, whether it's anger, sadness, joy, whatever, if there's emotion involved, then you should respond with an emotional response. Some unproductive responses are logic. Well, I don't know why you would see it that way. Facts. Well, let me tell you how it really is. And then start to list off the facts. That's unproductive. Reasons. Well, I can tell you why it's happening that way. If so-and-so would stop doing this, then that would stop happening. So that's reasons. It's unproductive. Number 4 is criticism. Well, you shouldn't think that way. Why would you think that way? That's silly. That's criticism. It's unproductive. Number 5 is your own needs and hurts. Well, you think you had a bad day, you ought to hear about mine. You're complaining about that? I mean, I've got it twice as bad as that. That's unproductive. Number 6 is neglect. I don't want to hear it. I'm up to here with my own day. I don't have time for it today. Actually, withdrawal is the greatest form of rejection. So, number 6, neglect is another unproductive response. Some productive responses are understanding. Wow, I can see why you would feel that way. If that happened to me, I'd probably feel the same way. 2, empathy. Again, that happened to me one time and I was very frustrated too. And by the way, when you express empathy, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're agreeing with what the person is saying. It just means that you understand how they feel. And it's a very productive response. Number 3 is gentleness. Just handling the situation with gentleness. It's very productive. And number 4 is reassurance. Reassuring them that trouble won't last always. Morning lasts for a night, but joy comes in the morning. Look, I know this is really tough. This situation at work is really causing you lots of frustration, but it won't last forever. Just reassuring them that things will get better. Those are productive responses when an emotion is shared. So, acceptance is a gift that we give each other. It's like handing someone a gift when you accept them. And acceptance and approval are very different. And it's very important to understand the difference. Approval says, what you're doing is okay with me. That's approval. Acceptance says, I take you the way you are. And it's very important to understand the difference. If you don't, you will confuse the fact that you're accepting your spouse as approval for what they're doing. And that's really tough for a husband or a wife to do. I can't accept that. I can't accept you right now because of the way you're acting. I can't accept you because of what you did. Well, you're actually not approving of the way that they're acting, or you're not approving of the thing that they did. But if you don't accept them, there will be hopelessness. So acceptance and approval are two very different things. Now, this is huge because acceptance comes before change. That is a principle that you want to write down and remember. Acceptance comes before change. Think about it. You won't change for anyone that doesn't accept you. Why? Why would you? If I'm going to go to all this trouble to change, and tomorrow you're going to bail on me, why go to all the trouble to change? I need acceptance before I change. It is a principle that is always true. Acceptance comes before change. This is true, by the way, like so many of the principles in this program, This is true not only in your marriage, it works for just about every other area of your life. It works great with your kids. If your kids don't feel accepted, they're not going to change. If they feel like your love is conditional, it's going to cause problems. It's a principle that works on the job. If you have a coworker or a team member and you don't accept them, they're not going to change anything for you because they don't feel accepted by you. It's important to understand two things when it comes to acceptance. First of all, you are not responsible for your spouse's behavior. You're just not. It's not your responsibility what they say or do. And secondly, you are not responsible for your spouse's growth. Now, we want to be able to force them to grow or change their behavior, but think about it for a minute. One of the things that fascinates me the most about God is that in His sovereign power, He has the ability and the power to break our will and make us do something, but He won't do it. He will never touch our will. And if God won't do it, who are we to think that we can break someone's will and make them grow or change their behavior? It's just not going to happen. So again, you're not responsible for your spouse's behavior, and you're not responsible for their growth. Now I want to talk to you about communication. I want to give you a definition, and if you will look, it's written in your couples manual. It says that communication is the free exchange of thoughts, ideas, opinions, and feelings. It is open and honest, and in it you make yourself feel vulnerable, yet you know that you will remain committed to each other. Again, that's based on acceptance. The problem is we don't like to be open, honest, and vulnerable. Vulnerable is the big one. I don't want to feel vulnerable because when I allow myself to be vulnerable, I'm afraid that you're gonna give me a left jab from out of nowhere. You're gonna say or do something to me that just catches me off guard. So we don't like to be vulnerable. But good, healthy communication puts you in a very vulnerable position. The only way you can do it is when you know that your spouse fully accepts you. Once again, I don't mean to belabor the point, but they may not approve of everything that you're doing. Again, approval and acceptance are two different things. They may not approve, but they accept you for who you are. So, if you will look in your couples manual, you'll see an iceberg there, and it depicts 3 levels of communication. And the top tip of the iceberg is something that couples talk very freely with each other about, and that's events and other people. That's conversation when you come in, how was work today? The kids need new tennis shoes. This is what we're doing Friday night. So it's easy to talk about events and other people. The next level down, right at the water level, right at the water surface there, is ideas. Those are a little more difficult to talk about. Those would be things like our spiritual beliefs. Do you believe that this scripture is saying the same thing that I believe it's saying? It may be an idea about your future, what you plan to do for retirement. Again, it's a deeper level, and ideas are more difficult to talk about. Some couples can do it, but it's a harder level of communication. But as you can see below the water line is this huge mass, this huge part of the iceberg, and that is the deepest level, and that level is the level of feelings. The level of feelings. Those are the hardest to talk about, but listen, they are the most important level of communication to talk about, our feelings. Most couples talk on the level of events and other people. Few go to the level of ideas, but rarely do couples get down below the surface to the greater mass of feelings. Listen, we must get to the point where we can discuss our feelings with each other. Thinking leads to feelings, which leads to behavior. That would be a good thing to write down. Thinking leads to feelings, which leads to behavior. So if I have the thought long enough, it's going to stir up a feeling inside of me. And the longer I have that feeling inside of me, eventually I'm going to act out on that feeling. Now that's not always bad. The process works for good thoughts and good behavior as well. But you can trace them all back to a thought. So it's very important that we're able to communicate our thoughts and our feelings clearly so that our spouse understands them. So every behavior can be traced back to a thought. Now here's some communication pitfalls to avoid. The first is the use of absolutes, things like always and never. Now, I have to admit, this was a very difficult one for me. I had the tendency to use absolutes often. I would say, you always nag me. You always nag me. Or you always do this. Or you never do that. Or every time this happens, you do that. It was just a big part of my vocabulary. And it causes lots and lots of problems. And you know why absolutes? And I'm referring to negative absolutes, by the way. No one minds a positive absolute. You always look beautiful. Nobody minds that one. We're talking about negative ones. But the reason why negative absolutes always cause problems is because they're never true. They're never completely true. And they will cause a knee-jerk defense mechanism to arise in your spouse, or anyone for that matter, that will want to argue them. Another pitfall to avoid is what some might call gunny sacking, or just not dealing with the issues. I had a tendency to do that. I felt like I was being a good guy by not saying anything right now. But actually what I was doing was I was gathering evidence, every time. I was putting it into my memory bank, and I was gunny sacking, and I was building up this supply of evidence and details so that when I did finally blow it, I'd come across like a prosecuting attorney and be able to make my case with all of these facts that I had stockpiled. Another communication pitfall to avoid is predicting reactions. In other words, when I say this, I know what she's going to say back to me. Or when this happens, I know how she's going to respond. Or I know how he's going to respond. The problem with that is we're often wrong. And because of the way we communicate the thought, expecting that reaction, it comes across in a very bad way. Another pitfall to avoid is assuming and presuming, very much like predicting reactions. I assume that she's thinking this, or you may presume that he feels this way. The next is passive listening. And again, I hate to tell all of my faults, but that was another one that was a great challenge for me. I often didn't really care what Evie was saying, so I would be the typical old cartoon character with the newspaper in front of me saying, yes, until Evie started asking me what she had just said to me, and I didn't know. Passive listening, you might as well say, due to lack of interest, today has been canceled. In other words, because I'm not interested, your day didn't happen. It's a terrible pitfall. The next is negative or critical listening. And we touched on this a little bit in the first lesson, but it's when I'm listening to my spouse talk, I'm very negative about what she's saying, and I'm very critical because her line of thinking doesn't work like my line of thinking. I criticize her for it. You shouldn't think that way. Why would you think that? Why would you say or do that? Because I don't see it that way. A huge pitfall, negative or critical listening. The next is preaching. I don't even know if I have to describe this one. It's obvious. I'm telling you the way that it is. It's actually called didactic communication. Didactic would be a great word for you to look up and get the full meaning of it. It's preachy teaching. It actually has its place in sermons. It has its place in some education, an adult to a child. So all of didactic communication is not bad, but in a conversation between a husband and a wife, it's definitely a pitfall. So preaching, didactic statements, communication is a pitfall. The next is nagging. That one's probably a no-brainer too. Constantly nagging, constantly making my point. You don't ever seem to get my point, so I'm going to repeat it over and over and over and over again. It is a huge pitfall. So, if you would like a better way to communicate, I have a great technique for you. I suggest that you use the live communication technique. I've outlined the first few letters in your couples manual for you. I'm going to give you the words, and then I'm going to come back to them and explain them in more detail. Again, the acronym is LIVE, live. L is for listen. I is interpret. V is validate. And E is express. So, now that you've written those words, listen, interpret, validate, and express, I want to give you a few more words to go along with them to help explain them. Line 1 would say, listen carefully. And that sounds like an easy thing to do, but it's actually a very difficult thing to do for some people. Again, it was a challenge for me because I don't think fast on my feet. So I would have a tendency when Evie was talking to me, half of my brain would be listening to her, but the other half would be thinking ahead of what I'm going to say next. It was just a way that I tried to compensate for my inability to think fast on my feet. So I was not really listening carefully. Listening carefully means that you shut everything else in your mind down and you focus in on your spouse and listen intently to what they're saying. Listen carefully. Interpret what you heard. Interpret what you heard. What I mean by that is, after you have listened carefully and heard everything that your spouse is saying, say it back to them. It doesn't have to be a play-by-play, rendition of what they just said. But just say back to them in just a few sentences, what I heard you saying is, and then repeat it back to them. Or say, I understand what you're saying. You feel that, and then rehearse back to them what they said. Now, the cool thing about this is, first of all, it excites them. They feel warm fuzzies. They feel good about this because you're actually listening. And you're not only listening, you're taking the time to repeat it back to me to make sure that you understood what I had to say. So this gives them the opportunity to either say, yes, you got it right. That is what I was saying. Or they may say, you got the first half right, but the second half is not what I meant to say. So that gives you the opportunity to say, well, tell me that part again. I really want to understand. I really want to hear you. Listen, people want to be heard. This is huge. The next one, validate. Validate with empathy. Empathy just means I know what you're feeling. I can relate to this. So validate with empathy. Say something like, I can imagine if that happened to me, I'd probably feel the same way too. I'd probably be very upset. Now, I think I mentioned it before, but the challenge with empathizing with someone is, especially when we're upset with our spouse, we have a tendency to think that if we empathize with them, it's going to come across as though we're agreeing with what they said when we may disagree with a lot of what they just said. But someone that's emotionally mature will have the ability to empathize even though they don't agree with every point. They might say, I don't agree with every point that you made, but I have to admit, if that was me and I thought that, I would be terribly upset, or I would be terribly hurt. So empathizing with somebody is very healthy, even though it's not an admission or an agreement on every point that they made. And then the last is simply express your feelings. Now the tables are turned. Now it's my turn to talk, and you're going to switch to the L position and listen carefully. So if you exercise this technique properly, you will find that you're able to say what you need to say. You're able to communicate it clearly and make sure that you're heard. And know that the person has not only heard you, your spouse is actually feeling what you're feeling. This is absolutely huge. It's huge. People want to be heard. So, use the live technique as often as you can this week, and trust God once again to use this truth to begin to transform the communication of your marriage.